Welcome to you all. Welcome to Karori Library, and welcome here for this special event with our very special guest, Redmer Yska. So my name's Gábor Tóth, and I am the local and New Zealand history specialist for Wellington City Libraries. Redmer is a Wellington writer and historian, and like me, he grew up here in Karori and began his career as a reporter with the New Zealand Truth. Moving into the 1980s, he helped found In Touch magazine, and he wrote for just about every local newspaper and magazine in that era, including Wellington Cosmo, Rip It Up, and Scope. Later in the 1990s, I remember read writing for City Voice, and as well as dozens of feature articles in national magazines such as the New Zealand Listener up to the present day. Now in 1990 he pivoted into history, publishing his first book, New Zealand Green, covering the history of cannabis use in New Zealand, which interestingly I know as a librarian actually remains one of our most stolen books of all time. And we've only got one copy left in the rare books room, locked away, yeah. Followed in 1993 with All Shook Up, The Flash, Bodgy and the Rise of the New Zealand Teenager. Now, I recall this when it came out. It was one of the first serious investigations into the history of teenagers and popular New Zealand culture in the 1950s. But I got to know Redmer when I was working at the Wellington City Archives, when he was commissioned as part of a Millennium Project that the City Council was doing. Commissioned via the Ministry of Culture and Heritage, or the Heritage Branch of Internal Affairs as it was at the time, for this extraordinary book, Wellington, Biography of a City, published 2006, I think so? Yeah. This is a remarkable history, not only about the history of the Wellington City Council, but by default it becomes an extraordinary history of our city in itself. Now, other works followed, such as his history of his old employer, the New Zealand Truth newspaper. Now, I know it's really easy for many of us who recall the Truth, how easy it is to dismiss it as a smutty sort of gutter rag. But as Redmer showed in his book, for earlier generations, the Truth was really a fearless mouthpiece for the working man, and it would take on the establishment in a manner that no other newspaper could, and it really fought for the rights of workers, the rights of Maori before anybody else was, and it campaigned vigorously and successfully for the abolition of capital punishment in New Zealand. But the spark that had led us to being here tonight began nearly a decade ago in 2014, when he was the recipient of the New Zealand History Trust Fund Award, which allowed him to write this book, A Strange, Beautiful Excitement, Katherine Mansfield's Wellington, 1888 to 1903. And that, in turn, led to his latest work, published just a few months ago, Katherine Mansfield's Europe, Station to Station, which marks the centenary of her death. So, Redmer, welcome. Yeah. Now, although I know we are really here to celebrate the publication of your new book, it's fitting that I think being here in Karori that we take the opportunity to discuss your first book about Mansfield that concentrated on her childhood here in Wellington. A Strange, Beautiful Excitement, published about 5 years ago. So, with that earlier book being a springboard to this new one, how did that first book come about, and how did your interest in this sort of begin?
I just want to say hi everyone. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. It's just really, really wonderful to be here. And yeah, an answer to your question about what led to the first Mansfield book, in a word, drains. Municipal drains. And in 2012, I was asked by Helen Hawke, I don't know if Helen is here, to give a talk about what was happening in Wellington in the 1890s, at the time when Mansfield was growing up. And I just had sort of recently written this long municipal history, so I knew lots about infrastructure, lots about infectious disease epidemics. And I was able to kind of sort of look quite closely at the world that Mansfield was growing up in, and I was instantly struck by the fact that the family moves to Karori in 1893, and there'd always been the sense that the move had been a lifestyle choice that the family had just thought it would be nice for the kids to grow up in a nice rural setting. But it became clear to me that as I looked into this stuff, that actually the family were, like a lot of families, very frightened about their children dying from nasty infectious diseases like typhoid. In fact, Mansfield's younger sister, Gwen, as a baby, died in the birthplace house, and so in fact, when I really looked into the history, it seemed that the family were really pretty frightened, and so they'd actually come up here for that reason. And what was more amazing to me was that I could read some of this into some of Mansfield's stories, like A Birthday Prelude and the Garden Party. Lots of concern about infectious disease, things like this, So I was amazed that I could actually, look at Mansfield and try and find something new to say about Mansfield. I mean, Mansfield is this sort of monolith, this kind of brand, Trying to say something new about Mansfield is trying to say something new about Tuesday, And in fact, it seemed to me that there'd never been a proper historical contextualization of the time when the family moved here. So that's really what sparked me to think about and to reimagine what was going on at the time. And it was interesting for me, when I started doing this work, the fact that I'd been to the same primary school as Mansfield Karori Main. I was at Karori Main a long time ago, and I grew up down by the park where Mansfield's Chesney Wold House was, and things. So that was quite a strange thing to think of. I mean, I just sort of asked the question: how many biographers get to have gone to the same primary school as their subject, who have played around the same bird bath, the same memorial bird bath, etc. Yeah. So that was some of the background.
Yeah. I mean, and the other thing is. So I've put together a few slides. I don't know how well you can see them there at the back. So here we have Chesney Wold. This is a very old photograph. This goes back to the 1880s, I suspect, well before they moved in. And you'll recognise the outline of the hills behind them. But here we are here in this building. But some of you, if you were old school Karoriites, will remember this building. Which was the library that read, you probably remember this vividly, and coming to this library. But before then, there was this library.
And actually, this is the one that I know because Mum worked there in the 60s, and so that was the one that I knew really well.
Yeah, right on the spot where we're standing now. And before this building, this one here was built in 1902. There was another one which unfortunately is just out of sight. It was over to the right of this. But it's almost, I mean, when you think about it, she would have walked past here. Like, she would have been in here.
Absolutely right, yeah. I mean, I think it's quite amazing to think that, that she was really walking the Karori main road to and from school every day for years. And I've got a little bit of stuff that I wrote here, and I thought I might read out. It partly comes from strange, beautiful excitement. But I mean, I think I'd really like to say that Karori was Mansfield's happy place. When she writes about her beloved Monton, she said, "My heart beats for Monton like it beats for Karori." And we all kind of slightly go, whoa, because we don't sometimes feel that way about Karori. But I think we probably need to a bit more, because her father Harold, he recalled the family's 5 years in Karori as the family's 5 happiest years, and it was partly, I think, that the kids were at that age and they were in a very beautiful setting, But I think it's amazing to think of Mansfield walking along Karori Road, trudging this, at the time, what was an unsealed, unpaved road, often, covered with mud. Mrs. Beecham was trying to get the borough council to seal the road because her daughter's pinafores were always getting so much mud on them, you know. And so we've got Mansfield walking here 5 days a week for 4 or 5 years. And it was mainly sweeping farmland at the time, like we can see there. A few macrocarpa, a lot of animals, some of them wild. And a wee bit, well, once you got into this little area, but think of a location for a western, a bit like Deadwood, lots of wooden buildings, verandas and horse railings. And let's imagine her on the road outside. It's 9:20 in the morning. She's in her school pinafore, trailing her 2 big sisters, she's about 20 metres behind them. She'd always walk a long way behind her sisters. And she's passing the junction of Parkvale and Karori Road. Maybe she's speeding up. The first of 2 school bells has rung. There were two bells. And once you heard that first one, you had to really move, signalling the start of classes. On one side of the road was the 2-storey Karori General Store and Bakery. And Mansfield would have loved the currant buns on sale at that place, costing a penny each. And across the road, pretty much right where we are now, was an old interdenominational chapel that was the original Karori Library. And how could she not have walked past here and wanted to, come into that place and take books out? Because at the age of 8, when she was walking to school every day, she was reading widely and sneaking books to bed at night, reading them by candlelight in her room when she was meant to be asleep. And the result was that she strained her eyes. So we have this amazing picture on the back cover of her. There she is. Look at that. So her parents had to have her fitted with round spectacles and gold wire rims. So there she is, not looking terribly happy actually. And I want to make another remark about this current Karori Library that I thought I'd like to, which was it was upstairs in this very building that I made a vital research breakthrough while researching Strange Beautiful Excitement. As we know, the Doll's House is her favourite story, is her most famous Karori story. And it's partly set at Karori School, where the Beecham girls began their education. She wrote it in 1921, a quarter of a century after she walked here past us. And she wrote it high on a Swiss mountain in a nut-brown chalet that could have come out of Heidi. And she writes about the social melting pot that was Karori at that time. And she wrote about pitiful Lil. Do we all know the story? We do, eh? Pitiful Lil and our Elsie. The washerwoman's daughter who wear hand-me-downs. The 2 little stray cats in the story. At playtime, the Kelvies are sneered at and shunned. Some parents even bar the kids from talking to them. And after school, all the other girls take their turn to visit the Burnell sisters' perfect doll's house. But it's clear that this offer cannot possibly be extended to the Kelvie girls. Now, it's long been a part of the KM story that a real Kelvie family lived locally. And Mansfield's first biographer wrote of a washerwoman named Annie McKelvey. And this Mrs. McKelvey makes her debut in a Mansfield story called Autumn's One. Every Monday morning, to the round open space in the middle of the wild orchard, the servant's girl and the washerwoman carried the wet linen, grandmother's night dresses, father's striped shirts, the hired man's cotton trousers, and the servant girl's dreadfully vulgar salmon pink flannelette drawers, jigged and slapped in horrid familiarity. So I set out to find more about the McKelveys, the correct spelling of their name, perhaps to learn more about why she featured the family in the Doll's House. And pinning down the family history after all this time proved surprisingly easy. Upstairs, I found filing cabinets conveniently labelled Karori History. This was material lovingly gathered by the local historical society, just waiting for someone like me to come along. In manila folders were the reminiscences of an aged McKelvey aunt. There were written descriptions of the cramped, poorly ventilated workers' cottage where the family lived in the 1890s, way down damp South Karori Road. I mean, South Karori Road, it was never a very appetising place, was it? Just saying. I was lucky we didn't have to live there. And I learned that the real Annie McKelvey was an intelligent, vivacious woman. She supplemented the limited family income by taking and washing for wealthy households. She was a cheery presence at Chesney Wold on Mondays. She boiled up the Beecham girls' blue pinafores in a copper heated over an open fire and ironed the family's clothes. And Lily was born in March 1888, 7 months before Mansfield. Elsie came in 1890. And the fictional girls do finally get to see the doll's house, don't they, at Chesney Wold, just for a minute before they're banished. "I seen the little lamp," says Else. So tonight I want to acknowledge the sterling work of the Karori Historical Society, this year marking its first half century. Yay. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So, following on from the success of Strange Beautiful, how did you come to work on your new book, Katherine Mansfield's Europe Station to Station? Did one flow directly from the other? I mean, was there a period of reflection as you sort of stepped away from Strange Beautiful? And how did the idea come that you could take this further to find another aspect of her life that hadn't been completely picked over and dissected by previous biographers?
I know, I think when I finished Strange Beautiful Excitement, I really thought I was done with Mansfield. I mean, and it had been a really great experience. I mean, this theory about about why the family moved seemed to hold up, which was great. And Gábor helped me find Mansfield's first published story in a volume at Karori Library, which was an incredible find, plus her first 2 published letters. So, yeah, there was gold there, And in a way, after all that, I thought, oh well, that's it for now. But I couldn't help when I went overseas in 2017 with my daughter, just to sort of pop into a few Mansfield locations. Just had to have a look, and so I was really struck in Bad Wörishofen, Germany, when we went to the little town where she lived when she was 20 and lost her child, that there were luxury apartments there which were named after Mansfield. Her name was still quite prominent in the town. And in the small town of Fontainebleau, Avon, in France, where she's buried, I saw her name on more plaques in that little town than all of Wellington. So I thought there's something going on here, and so I started thinking about Mansfield and her connection to Europe. Really, I mean, I think we always associated her with the Bloomsbury set, with Virginia Woolf, and we sort of, and in a way, all the biographies have been written by Brits, most of them have anyway, and the Brits have kind of grabbed her, kind of colonised her. Is that the word? Can I say that? But in fact, she's, especially after the first stay in London, she couldn't really wait to leave London. She would escape across the Channel. Europe became her happy place, her wonderland, really.
Do you think she was? Did this really impact the nature of her work, or was it more? Did the place influence her work, or was she just really trying to separate herself from the distractions of the Bloomsbury set and everything else that was going on in the UK with her dodgy marriage and so on?
I think she loved to travel. I mean, in a sense, with these 2 books, I moved from drains to trains. Sorry. I mean, she was someone who, who travelled by train when it was cheap. So you see her travelling alone without a chaperone, completely happy, roaring across Europe. That was very well connected by trains, as it still is. Having a ball, looking out the window, writing stuff down. So I think the whole sort of travel sort of side of it was so easy for her. And I think she'd stop in places like Paris and enjoy that, and she found some great places to write. But I think what really happens for her in those places is that Paris particularly, and also Bandol in the south of France, being around sort of bodies of water and things like this, and even in the south of France, quite a lot of wind, kind of anchors her back to New Zealand in a funny way. And kind of, so she's in these places. She's also not with a husband, so she doesn't have to look after him. Yeah. He was quite a high sort of maintenance guy, I think. And so she's got room to write. She's actually free to write. And so she gets to work. She's incredibly diligent, and gets so much stuff done. She's got this incredible working style. So she's able to get the work done, really, I think.
Yeah, I mean, many of us I know will be aware of her connection to Menton, and yet there are all of these other places that you describe in the book that she visited and stayed at and fell in love with, and then moved on from. And I sort of felt that there was a parallel thing, and that was the number of lovers that she had, and she seems to fall in and out of love with both men and places, and some of these guys were quite remarkable. I mean, the one that really struck me was Francis Carco, a French sort of up and coming writer, and the way that he seems to be completely besotted by her. So could you tell us a wee bit about the mysterious Mr. Carco?
Well, I think Carco was essentially the man with a flat, and which so he became a very helpful ally, really. And I think they have this initial, affair when she first meets him, and he becomes representative of the glamour of Paris, really, and all of that. But then he goes to war. He's up at the front. He's actually not really fighting. He's got a job, probably quite a good job during wartime. He's the postman for the bakery unit, about 7 miles from the front. So he wasn't doing very much serious fighting. So she goes up to. She basically is. She's already with John Middleton Murray, living in London, but she's having this sort of secret romance with Carco, and goes over the channel, stays at his flat initially, does some work there. This is on the banks of the Seine, which I write about in the book, and a most extraordinary flat. And then she goes up to the front, and they do have a few days together, but it doesn't really work out. I don't think she really fancies him, but she wants to continue to have access to the flat, so she keeps on writing the billets doux, the old love letters. But yeah, after that she kind of hears he's going to be coming back, so she leaves. But I mean, she does after she's had that fling with him, go straight back to John Middleton Murray. Okay. So I think she's not really doing that. I mean, I think she's essentially John Middleton Murray becomes her mainstay, really, even though they have a lot of difficulties. They're sort of soulmates, really. Yeah, they are. Yeah. I mean, it's a long, complicated a relationship. But I mean, Mansfield loves going to new places for inspiration and that sort of thing. And I think she's got that whole idea about that sort of joy of travel thing. Like she goes somewhere, and for the first 24 hours, it's just the most fabulous place she's ever been at. But that awful thing is that she's actually taken herself with her. So, within 24 hours, it's like people start to annoy her. She starts to annoy her, and the servants aren't up to much, and the food ain't. So there's a whole joy of travel thing where So you sort of see that with her, and she keeps on writing, and she keeps on writing letters. She pumps them out. so many of them, and that in a sense became the spine of Station to Station. Because she writes what I call these "wish you were here" letters to all her different friends. You've got to come to this place, Bundol. You've got to come and see Monton. You've got to come and see this and come and see that. Yeah.
I mean, just along that point, I mean, writing this book, you faced some, considerable trials, COVID-19 epidemic, and the other process I was thinking about is trying to tie together these letters that you're talking about, these hundreds of letters, all of these documents, within the archives of the Alexander Turnbull Library, and studying them, and then you've got to travel and visit these places. How did you tie the two together? I mean, trying to make the connection between a letter and then visiting the place. Did you read the letters first and then go? Or did you visit and then try and tie them back to spending hours, I imagine, in the reading room of the ATL? Yeah,
I mean, I was sort of operating on a range of different fronts, really. I mean, there's someone that I really admire, an English biographer called Richard Holmes, and Holmes has got this approach where he says you've got to go to all the places. If you're going to write a biography, you've got to go to the places where the subject lived, and that was quite a sort of an important idea for me. So I was very much doing that with her. I mean, I just decided that I wanted to go to these places, see what I could find. A really important part of the story for me was actually meeting some key people. I met in Fontainebleau a guy called Bernard Bosque, who tends her grave, who places petunias on her grave, and he's a very loyal Mansfield follower. And I got to know.
I think the next slide, I think maybe him. I think just it's coming up.
Yeah. So this is.
Oh, here he is.
Yeah. So this is Bernard. He's standing at Grey, and that's actually Mansfield with Carco, which is where they had their little assignation, the indiscreet journey, voyage indiscret. And so when you go to these places, you get a whole new perspective on them, really. And so Bernard, we got on really well from the start, and he as I say, he looks after her tomb at Avon. He runs her annual birthday parties. He's a school teacher and forest guide who's mapped out her trails through France and Switzerland, places that she crossed by train. And in 2018, when I was still sort of thinking, is there a book here? Do I really want to do this? Is there something else to say? He said, come to Switzerland, because that's where he has his annual holidays. His family makes a sort of pilgrimage there to this little place in a place called Valois in Switzerland, which is where Mansfield lived during 1921. And just being in that place, being up on that mountain where she lived, and with the view of the Alps around her, just gave me such a powerful sense of what she was up to, really. It's hard to put into words the power of actually being in those places, But what also struck me was also that she's up there looking at these Alps, the most extraordinary view from the top of the mountain, and she's downloading Eastbourne. She's downloading a Karori. She's downloading Thorndon, through At the Bay, the garden party, and the doll's house. I mean, so she's got this incredible memory. She's decided that she wants to go back to New Zealand. So there she is up on this mountain, doing this amazing work.
One section of the book that I particularly loved was when you describe how she acquired a handgun around the time that she moves to the Italian town of Ospedaletti. And I looked it up on Google Maps just yesterday, and I realised it's barely 30 kilometres from Monton. It's just literally over the border, over into Italy. And now we sort of got an image of Mansfield being this sort of waif-like sort of flapper, but here she is blasting away at olive trees in the backyard of her Italian cottage with a handgun, and it's sort of completely at odds with the image that sort of many of us have of her. I mean, how did she come to acquire a handgun, and did she ever have cause to use it?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to back up the truck maybe a wee bit. I mean, at the time she goes there, she's really, really ill, and I think that's a thing I want to sort of touch on, you know, at this stage, because this is also the story about someone with a terrible disability who's getting sicker and sicker, you know. She's got tuberculosis, and it starts to really, really affect her by the time she goes to Italy. I mean, she's gone there to find, you know, that she's finding air that she can breathe better, because she's got this terrible cough, you know. She's permanently and when she goes there in 1919 with her husband, she stays in a little hotel in San Remo, just around the corner from Ospedaletti, and she's coughing so much at the time that she gets kicked out. And at that time, Spanish flu is roaring through Europe. So you've got like you know, I mean, tuberculosis was always a long, slow-moving disease, but Spanish flu was, you know, racing through Italy. She gets kicked out. She's got to pay a deep cleaning fee for her room, and she's basically has to be quarantined. And that was amazing to be, you know, writing about this during COVID, actually, for me, to think about 100 years earlier. She was experiencing a lot of this stuff as well, and so she wants to stay in this place, and she gets told about a little cottage up on the hill. But this is I mean, why she was in Italy at that time is also a whole other, there's actually like a whole kind of book in that, because, I mean, that's the year that Mussolini forms his party. In fact, it's called Italy's Red Year, where there was almost a sort of revolution there. So there's lots of ex-soldiers, you know, because it's the end of World War I, who are roaming around, you know, who don't like foreigners. So she gets a gun.
Right. Yeah.
And she's given this by the guy at the hotel. But yeah, there she is. You know, she's up on the hill with Ida. And she's, you know, getting stung by mosquitoes, and this is the end of the year, and she's not terribly pleased about that. But yeah, she's wandering around the hilltop with Ida, smoking, and because she keeps smoking throughout her, you know, having tuberculosis. We probably wouldn't do that today. And she decides to learn how to use the gun. So she actually writes about the experience of being out in the garden in her purple Jaeger dressing gown, with a fag in the corner of her mouth, you know, learning to load and unload the gun, blasting it into olive trees, you know. And she says that firing the gun makes her feel like a new being. So she's into it, you know, and so she won't give it back. She's only borrowed the gun, but actually she won't give it back. She keeps it for the next 2 or 3 years, and she says, you know, in Switzerland, you know, on the side of my bed is a copy of Chaucer, a copy of Shakespeare, my Japanese fan, and my automatic revolver. So I think when we see Mansfield with a gun, we kind of, it's quite strange, isn't it? We sort of slightly see her differently. We sort of get her out from behind the ink pot in a way, you know. And I try to do that with strange, beautiful excitement, to see her at you know, Wellington Girls, not so much Marsden, just saying. You know, she was really happy at WGC, and you know, we see her there as a gymnast. She's a really good gymnast. We see her as a swimmer, you know, learning how to swim, really being pretty good at it, and quite competitive. And in Strange Beautiful, she's as well as being a gun owner, a pistol packing mama, she's also a snooker player. You know, she's really into snooker, which she learnt down at Premier House, and you know, and she also likes to knit, you know, play lots of cribbage, you know. So I love that idea of trying to see her as a person, you know, much more, and also, yeah, and at the same time, she, you know, by the time she's at Monton, she can't walk anymore. yeah, so we see her at Monton. We get all gooey-eyed about the Mansfield at Monton. She actually has to, get a carriage to kind of get around. She's so ill, and the illness is a really strong thing here, And I think her sort of that word, indomitable, that word that you never put in a speech, indomitable, death-defying, actually, and she knows she's got to get the work done. And that's what she's doing up in that chalet in Switzerland, pumping out these stories, the Doll's House. She pumps them out like in days, which is to me unbelievable. Longhand, although she might have had a typewriter by then. Anyway, I digress. Go.
I imagine there must have been several occasions when you visited these places that she lived in, went into the rooms that she wrote in or stayed in. And I was thinking perhaps even touched the same door handles that sort of she had touched. And I can imagine that there could have been quite a few emotionally charged, maybe even sort of overwhelming moments when you made that connection. I mean, could you tell us about some of these and which of these places had the biggest personal impact for you?
Well, I mean, I had this amazing experience when I went to Paris, and I stayed at the hotel on the left bank called the Victoria Palace Hotel, where she had lived during 1922.
Is this it?
There it is.
Yeah.
And so let's just look at this. This is down this little side street, and then I got into her room. This is her room. This is her suite, where she lived for 6 months. So she's in the suite, and so she, is just able to kind of, it's got a very good bathroom. She can get hot. She has a lot of hot baths, and during the day she's getting radiotherapy across the city. So she comes back to the place having had her insides blasted with X-rays. She's so crook from this awful treatment, and so she looks across. Can you just pause this one?
Yeah,
she's parked here at the window, and there's this internal courtyard. This is the room that she was in. I got up to the room. I had to nag the concierge for days, and they finally let me up. And I had about 10 minutes in the room, and so I'm up there. And from here, she looked across to an apartment across there, and there was a woman who brought out during the day her canaries in wooden cages, and she would lie there on the settee, and this was across this courtyard, and the birds would sing, and they'd make her so happy because she had a lot of birds when she was living up here in Karori, So this was, she'd be sort of, these were the sort of couches she'd be sprawling on,
right?
And so to actually know that this was where she decided that she'd write her final story called The Canary, as a result of hearing these birds, to be in that room. To think of her being in that place was very, very powerful for me. To think of her being that ill but being that sort of comforted.
Yeah.
And it was there that she actually decided to write that story. Also being in Germany as well, when I went to the little town of Bad Wörishofen and got into the archives there was a story about a little boy. After she loses her baby, she's very sad in this place, this little town in Germany about an hour from Munich. She decides to stay in the town. So her friend Ida thinks it would be very nice if a little 8-year-old boy might be sent from London to accompany her for a couple of months. So this little 8-year-old is put on the train with a sort of ticket round his neck and sent 1,000 kilometres to Catherine, the rich woman in Germany, because he'll get some good food, and he's sent from the East End. And so this little boy comes to stay with her in her room in Germany. And so there'd been the stories about this, and I was able to find out in the archives how long little Walter stayed for. I found that a most moving and extraordinary and sort of sad story, And she does write about this little boy, and he was not well. He had a big sort of distended stomach because he had a lot of sort of malnutrition. So, he stays with her, she writes about him, and after 2 months, she puts him back on the train, and then he goes back to London, and she never sees him again. And we think that he's the one, because he was not well, that he gave her tuberculosis. So there's a kind of terrible sting in the tail of that. But to be in the archives and actually to see the movements of, because at that time, very much German efficiency, anyone coming to and from the town had to fill out a lot of documentation. So that's the stuff I was looking at. That was very moving.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, today we celebrate Mansfield as perhaps our greatest writer and certainly our greatest literary export. But it really wasn't always the case. And for decades, as you point out in the book, she was celebrated and remembered far more in France and to a lesser extent in Germany than she was in New Zealand. And your descriptions of her 50th birthday celebrations that took place in France, which barely rated a mention here in New Zealand. Why was this? Why has it taken us, relatively speaking, so long to recognise her genius?
I mean, when I came here tonight, I checked to see whether the plaque by the front door is still there, a plaque to Mayor Tar, the Mayor of Karori. And she wrote a story about Mayor Tar called Old Tar in 1919. And she skewered him, named him as basically called him a mad, greedy colonist. She would just name people, and she wouldn't change the names, and to protect the innocent, as they say, And so, from the safety of London, she asked her sister Jean not to leave a copy of the story Old Tar on the Karori Road, or I shall be taken up for libel. And so she wasn't. This didn't make her very popular. As we saw in Prelude, she talks about the next door neighbours, the Nathans. She might have changed their name, but she calls the children a swarm. They didn't like that. So when Ruth Mance comes here in the 1930s, she even hears about sabotage. That there's a story current that a large consignment of the first edition of Bliss was thrown in the harbour by people figuring in the stories who did not relish the manner in which they were drawn. So she really, she made a lot of enemies. But I mean, in France, they didn't really know about any of this. And in France, they didn't really care so much about the short stories. It was more the life, as they saw in the journals. I mean, the journals portray this thing about this beautiful woman with this terrible illness, almost like a kind of saint. So she's got this kind of saintly reputation there. She's got she's got the bob, the sort of Greta Garbo look. And she captures the imagination of the French. She really does. When she turns 50, Le Figaro puts her on the front page. It's amazing. There were stories about her in the French media, on French radio aimed at children. Her life, she was so famous over there. We really had no idea. And in a way, the French teach us to appreciate her. When our diplomats go there in 1949, they can't believe that there's the sort of that New Zealand is known in France because of her. Mm-hmm. We saw her as a sort of flaky person who had this sort of reputation as, rackety or whatever the word is, and that she wasn't this, but I mean, also I think in New Zealand, the kind of stories she was writing, which weren't popular at the time, like she was writing in the 30s about quite emotional stuff, whereas our writers were, doing a lot of sort of socialist realism, and it was all very practical kind of, realism stuff, whereas she was writing about feelings. We didn't really do feelings at that time, and so we kind of, there's these amazing quotes. I think Frank Sargison says in the 40s that Prelude is fine, but it's mainly about children. And he says in a talk, she's okay, but he struggles not to run her down too much, the poor girl. So there's this kind of male superiority that's just bizarre.
Is this part of that whole Caxton generation, sort of the rise of New Zealand, the nationalist writing?
Yeah. So she kind of it takes a while for us to kind of, but I think it's that thing where there's this great thing I found in the archives, in the MFAT archives actually. Our diplomats wrote about a reception that was held at our embassy in Paris in the mid '50s, and we would put on these parties there, cocktail parties, and and put the name Mansfield on the invitations, and these really powerful French politicians would turn up, these eminent ministers and stuff. And there's a story about one particular minister turning up. I think he'd worked on trying to settle Algiers. He was this super minister turned up, a guy called Jacques, and Jacques turns up, and our diplomats just can't believe he's in the room, and they say to him, Jacques, we're so happy to see you, and do you know much about Mansfield? And he says, Mansfield. When I was first married, my wife gave me a copy of Mansfield's journals and said, if you want to understand a woman, you must read this. I mean, could there be any higher praise from the French? There could not be.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you, Redmer. Yeah. Yes, we have. I was just about to say we have a few minutes for questions. 10 minutes or so.
Oh, Redmer, you were talking about Katherine using real names. I think she would have appreciated your work on the Truth, New Zealand Truth. I feel.
Yeah, well, I mean, she really did fancy herself as a journo, and actually on her passport it does say journalist, and I think she really wanted to be a journo. Yeah. Thank you.
I was just wondering about the First World War, and when she was in Europe, that surely must have interrupted all her.
It didn't seem to.
No.
I mean, she seemed just to swan around and avoid it all, really, and until the very end, when she ends up being stuck in Paris, as I say in the book, and there's a shell dropping every 17 minutes, and she can't get out, and war finally hits her. She's been swanning around. She's been going to parts of France where the war doesn't reach, in the south and things like this. So she's able to avoid it all. But finally she can't, and it's a real rude awakening for her. She gets very frightened, but she tries to get out, and she finally does, and at that point she's very, very, very ill. But she's able to get into France because of she can get special dispensation because of her illness. So she can kind of and eventually the French authorities get really grumpy with these POMs who swan in and sort of do that, and just sort of go to the south. So yeah, she kind of gets away with that. Although she does her trip to Grey, where she has that that visit to Kako, she does see some amazing stuff on the trains. She sees troops, and she actually writes about that. So that first-hand account, that journalism stuff, she does have. There is a little bit of that there. Yeah.
I read some parts of your book, Strange, Beautiful, Exciting Life of Katherine Mansfield, and I saw a picture, her house at Thornton, and there is a quotation about too square, too ugly, and too heavy for a heart like Katherine Mansfield. But I doubt that, because after saw the picture in your book, I visited that house, and I believe that it is a cozy and lovely house. I don't agree with why some critics say it's too square, too heavy, and too ugly. I really don't understand.
No, I mean, Iris Wilkinson, who said that, she'd like to be a bit poetic, and it's a bit of a poetic statement. I mean, it's not the most exciting house of all time. It's a bit boxy, So, you know, compared to some other houses, that was not the most elegant. I mean, her other house on Tinakori Road, which was demolished, that was a very, very fine house, a beautiful house. I mean, that really was an elegant house, and you know, and that was a lot more special, and it's a tragedy that it was lost, really, to build a motorway, which we wouldn't do now in the same way. Yeah.
How did they choose Walter?
I know. I think Ida came from sort of medical family. I think her father was a surgeon, and somehow there was a connection through the surgery, some sort of, you know, medical link, where the little boy was ill, and the parents were keen for him to have this experience, that it might be some sort of fresh air and some, you know, and he might have a good experience. Yeah. So I think it came that way. But yeah, it seemed like, it always feels to me like sort of rich people wanted something, and rich people got stuff done for themselves, you know. So, you know, it's quite a story, isn't it? It just, yeah.
Now, I just wanted to say, I live in Thorndon, and Fitzherbert Terrace in Thorndon, and the plaque for Katherine Mansfield is just around the corner. Mm. And now, didn't she live there? You haven't mentioned that she lived in Thorndon. You talk about Karori all the time.
If we were doing this talk in Thorndon, I'm sure.
How long have you got?
You should see my book. You should see my book. It's full of Thorndon.
That's all right.
It's crammed with Thorndon. It's got Thorndon coming out its ears.
Okay, I forgive you.
Hi, I was just wondering then, you say she was very popular in France, but with her being popular in France, were her books translated? Did she write in French? You know, I can't understand why.
Sure thing. No, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, she did speak French, and she would, you know, write a few letters in French. But no, her books were all translated there, and that's why they became so successful. John Middleton Murray, her husband, helped supervise the translations, and they were hugely successful in France, particularly the journals. And so, yeah, that was all about them being very, very well translated, beautifully packaged, etc. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I went in August, number 25, which was longer. I saw number 25 and 11. Which one did they live in longer in Thorndon?
Yeah, I think she's at the birthplace house for the first 5 years, and then they come back after being in Karori and go to 75 to Nakori for about another, I don't know, certainly a few years. They're both very, very, very central places to her. You know, they both have great meaning, but I'm afraid I can't give you the exact numbers there. But they were both places that she stayed out long, as well as, of course, Fitzherbert Terrace, the great, most important place.
Well, thank you very much, Redmer. That was wonderful. Thank you for your questions. Thank you very much for coming along. I hope you've all enjoyed it. I certainly have. So if you'd like to put your hands together, I think, for one last time.